like to welcome all of you to our World and Copyright Day event. And the theme for today's session is transforming role of IP in the era of technology. So I would like to welcome our chair first, Dr. Arul George Skaria, Co-Director, Center of Innovation, IP and Competition, Associate Professor at National Law University, Delhi. It's an immense pleasure to have you here, sir. Moving on, I would like to introduce our speakers for the day. Our first speaker is Mr. Ravi Shankar Jha, Lead Counsel at Windsor Games. It's such an immense pleasure to have you, sir. Moving on, our second speaker for the day is Mr. Manan Bhatt, Senior Associate, Partnership, Alta Incubation Center, Gujarat University, Startup and Entrepreneurship Council. Thank you, sir, for being a part. Moving on to our speaker number 3, Mr. Kapil Gupta, founder of Frontlist and Pragati. Thank you so much for being here. We shall start the session. Over to you all now.
Thank you. So first of all, thanks to IRRO, particularly the Secretary General of IRRO, Mr. Pranav Gupta, as well as my good friend, Mr. Ankit Sahni, for inviting me for this event and for chairing this session. And special thanks to IRRO for organizing this session on an extremely important topic, that is transforming role of IP in the era of technology, as part of the discussion on World Book and Copyright Day. As you can all imagine, we live in a world that sees constant creativity and innovation, right? And all of us would also agree that creativity and innovation are very fundamental for tackling many of the challenges which we face today, including equitable growth, health, and environment. And it is beyond doubt that IP laws, particularly copyright, would have an enormous impact on creativity and innovation. So how much impact it would make, or what kind of impact it would make, is certainly debatable, and it might also be very much context dependent. But it is undeniable that there are implications for IP. And as we can also imagine, IP always struggles to catch up with the technological challenges. What is important for us as a nation and as a global community is to find ways which can ensure a fair balance that promotes creativity and innovation, particularly by ordinary persons, startups, and medium and small enterprises in our country. And this panel is going to look at some of the very pertinent issues in this regard. And we are really fortunate to have an excellent team of 3 panelists with very extensive as well as diverse experiences in this regard. And I'm truly hoping that the discussions which we are going to have in the next 40 to 45 minutes will contribute to finding balanced IP approaches that can support sustainable development goals through promotion of creativity and innovation. So the first speaker whom we have is Mr. Ravi Jha, who, as introduced earlier, is a lead counsel with Windsor Games. And what makes him really unique is, one, he has this extensive legal experience. Then he also has extensive experience with technology. But apart from that, he also has extensive experience with working with different ministries. And in view of his extensive experiences in these 3 dimensions, I think one of the important questions which I would like to ask him is, what kind of opportunities as well as challenges he sees in the area of intellectual property in the context of emerging technologies, particularly some of the keywords which we hear these days like NFTs, metaverse, etc. Over to you, Ravi.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for inviting me over. Just to confirm, I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, yeah. So thanks again, and thanks again to Ankit Sahni, as you mentioned. He happens to be my friend as well. So glad to be joining such a esteemed panel. Now, of course, my experience is slightly diverse. I come from a business background. I have also worked with the government. So I was a business lawyer, corporate lawyer. And I have also advised on quite a few transactions in the technology industry. And where I am currently working, it happens to be literally at the forefront of all these buzzwords that we hear, which you mentioned, NFT, metaverse and all. And even though blockchain and everything that we started hearing a few years ago found its first major use case in the world of finance, all the other of these concepts, and to a great extent even blockchain, we will see being used more extensively in the area of gaming. And I've said this before on other platforms, that is, the road to metaverse is actually through gaming, or rather gaming in many ways, we'll see in few years will actually merge quite seamlessly with metaverse. So yes, but the way I look at it, having worked with the government and having seen the global landscape in terms of how the technology has developed, India for a very, very long time, let's say, when the manufacturing used to be the talk of the town, we missed the manufacturing bus. Then came this whole, one thing which we were able to catch on to was services industry. But the next frontier of technological development, social media and others, we again missed the bus. Right now, as things stand, nobody can say for sure how this whole emerging tech world will shape up. But what is clear that it is going to be really, really important, both from the perspective of strategic implications, as well as for the sake of technological development itself. So we cannot be sitting on our laurels and cannot afford to miss the bus there. We have to be very, very proactive. And one of the essential things that we need to do is to ensure that the laws that we have in place currently evolve in a manner which kind of propels the growth of these kind of industries in India. And of course, in the larger realm of intellectual property, there are several of concerns. So let's say if we talk about how NFTs are being transferred from one individual to another, or it is being licensed under copyright law. These are just very specific but rather minor examples, which says copyright licensing still requires a written contract. Whether these smart contracts will qualify as written contracts or not, which is just a set of instructions which execute themselves whenever certain things happen, dependent on it, that is a question that we need to answer. How will we enforce copyright? I mean, it took us many years to implement takedown measures for music videos and others on the internet. How will we do that when we transform into a world of metaverse? How will we determine the question of territoriality? Given that people will be traversing from one verse to another, even different devices, how will we determine that? I mean, although it might be virtually impossible to kind of develop those laws proactively, but we need to have our foot on the pedal on these questions. There are similar concerns around trademark, and whatever I'm talking is not a science fiction. Things are already happening. So Hermes Birkin, I guess it was, where one individual took this domain name Meta Birkins and was selling these Birkins, right? Hermes filed a case against it, saying that they were selling NFTs in the virtual world, and there was their argument was that it is kind of taking away from the actual sale of goods. We can think of a very, very wild example where, let's say, tomorrow, and Nike actually got into a legal battle on this issue, where certain people were selling, StockX was selling Nike virtual shoes in the metaverse, connected to some physical world benefits and all. Let's say, for example, tomorrow you start giving Nike shoes in a virtual reality driven metaverse, where people can experience it there without having to pay anything, and which means they probably don't need to buy it in the real world. I mean, this is just a very wild example, but a very possible example, right? Which can directly impact the bottom lines of the companies. Their sales could get impacted. And similarly, their sales could actually go up if they have proper protection of their trademarks in the virtual world itself. We have had such instances. Let's say many a times trademarks and logos have been used in video games, and courts in the United States in particular have been rather liberal in allowing it in the name of freedom of speech and expression. Will that doctrine, or can that doctrine continue once we enter into the world of metaverse, is a question, the kind of questions that we need to ponder over. So we really need to sit back and look at our IP laws, which were written decades ago. I mean, even today they are outdated in many sense. The pace at which technology is developing if these concerns are not addressed or studied properly and then addressed, it can potentially become an impediment in the way the technology develops. And for India, that means being again behind the curve so far as technological development is concerned. That will be my quick roundup of opening remark.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for those very thoughtful remarks. I'm sure many of the people who are hearing us on either Facebook or on other platforms would have many questions. Maybe let's now hear from Mr. Manan Bhatt, whom, as you already know, has been working with the Adult Incubation Center at the Gujarat University Startup and Entrepreneurship Council. And he also has extensive experience in incubating and advising startups in India. And based on that expertise, maybe the initial question which I would like to ask Manan is, to what extent is IP relevant for Indian startups?
First of all, thank you, Arul and Mr. Ankit for inviting me, and thank you, IRRO team and FIP team. Right. So, as all of know that startup industry currently is a hotcake industry in India, particularly, and everyone knows that there were, if we talk about half a decade ago, there were only a dozen of unicorns, and if we compare it today, we have the number is been 45 to into 7x and 8x growth. Right. So there is some strong backing which definitely needs to protect one's IP. Right, and IP is one of the most important thing for any of the startups, as it's always a kind of an asset, but which is definitely in the form of intangible. Right. It is equally important to one who is owning a gold or commodity, anything. Right. So IP is definitely one of the most important thing which a founder should be definitely work towards, because it gives you the the exclusive right to the creatives who is creating the content, or if you are from a process oriented startup or a product oriented startup, definitely patent gives you an marketing edge towards the other competitors, right? Because all these giants have already marked their IPs, and for example, they have their own IPs which are coming on a daily basis, right? So every couple of days or every thrice a days, they come up with a new IP in the form of processes or designs. So it's very competitive to beat such giants when you are working in this business. So the thing that government, I would like to quote something from the government's end. So the government is very supportive in this particular domain, especially from the IP protection laws and terminologies. So there is a subsidy to these startups and innovators, early stage startup and innovators who have no idea what is IP, or who. So they get an upper hand, and there is an 80% of subsidy to these new budding innovators and startups, and the grants are totally available free to them, worth 50 lakhs, and it is totally a non refundable to the government. Right. So yes, so as I mentioned that till 25,000 of rupees are provided as a subsidy to these startups, right? As well as the trademark and everything is done at a free of cost to these startup who gets incubated at any incubated startup, which is a technological business incubator with any center or state funded incubation centers. And to just give a number of, on average, each and every state has more than 30 to 40 incubation spaces, and each and every metro city has a huge number of incubation spaces where anyone who's willing to start their business can reach out to them, and they can avail these kind of facilities at free of cost. Right. So these are the things that from the government is supporting, especially from the IP thing. And definitely there is a very strong need, as my colleague, Ravi mentioned, that to protect your, the rights from a technological perspective as well as from the business perspective. It at the end, it definitely adds to the what value you are creating, and the second hand, it IP is always important from the investment perspective. So if you are raising any venture from any venture capitalist or an angel round, it gives an upper hand, because you do not need to show them the kind of trust. So there is a kind of a trust which IP gives to leverages a startup once they get incubated at these no-cost incubation spaces. And I would definitely give an my remark that definitely it creates a kind of trust to the stakeholders, and IP is definitely one of the necessity, and to compete with these big giants, IP protection is a must for any startup, and there are many people from this domain who can help you out in the market currently, right? So yeah, and it's always a entry barrier breaker for any of the new age venture. And government is there to support you at totally a zero cost. So it's basically to educate them that they can avail these kind of services. Yes, that is all from my end currently. Right.
Thanks, Manan, for giving a very comprehensive overview of some of the government initiatives, as well as highlighting the fact that yes, we need to do far more in terms of creating awareness among the startups and innovators with regard to intellectual property. Again, I have certain questions, and I'm sure our audience would also have many questions for you. I can already see like we have received like 3 questions. I'm sure more questions will be coming up as we proceed. Sure. But we'll come back to you after also hearing our next speaker, that is Mr. Kapil Gupta. So Mr. Kapil Gupta, again, as at least some of you would be knowing, he's a prolific entrepreneur, and he has founded different organizations like Logic, which is one of the leading digital marketing agencies, Pragati, a virtual exhibition platform, then Friendlist, which is a portal for publishing industry, then Solve Wellness, which is a mental wellness marketplace, and also Advit Toys, which is a board games company changing the landscape of learning. So his experiences are diverse. The kind of activities which he have initiated are also very diverse. So one of the things which I would like to ask him, maybe as the initial question, is what or how he actually perceives the dual role of technology, one as something that would promote creativity by stronger enforcement of IP rights, and the other as something that would facilitate easier copying of the IP protected goods. How do you actually see the dual role of technology?
Sure. Thank you so much. Anyway, so let me get to this interesting question of the role of technology. And every time I think technology and I think copyright, I actually want to go back to Alfred Nobel and think about how when dynamite was formed, there was a thought process: is it going to help us carve through mountains and create roads, or is it going to become the biggest destructor? And that is the role that technology plays in the area of intellectual property. On one side, technology can be used fabulously in preventing all sorts of piracy, in ensuring the law of the land, in ensuring all compliances and everything is done very well. And on the other side, the pervasiveness of technology and the pervasiveness of data and content means everybody has an ability to be able to share things, whether they are copyrighted, whether there is an intellectual property issue there, and across boundaries, across countries, and across geographies, it becomes an extremely challenging notion. Now, I want to restrict the discussion, considering today is World Book and Copyright Day. I want to restrict the discussion in some sense to the area of books and copyright only. And my first take on that is books and written literary works, they suffer from use of technology today, even though they can actually leverage technology to the hilt. I have had numerous levels of discussions with both the Indian Reprographic Rights Organization and also people who have been part of copyright and intellectual property industry. And my take has always been that you need to use technology in this area exactly the same, and you don't even need to do something new. You need to learn from your peers, learn from your peers in the software industry, learn from your peers in the music industry, learn from your peers in the movie industry. They have all implemented intellectual property. I mean, you can't even go to YouTube now and upload a video which has somebody else's music because YouTube will ban it. If that kind of technology, and it's very easy to implement technology. I'm not even talking about too much of artificial intelligence, too much of blockchain, too much of integration. I'm talking about at the base level. Digital should be able to help us take care of and control the entire area of intellectual property and copyright. At the same time, there is a lot of stuff that digital should be able to do in terms of helping provide people with the ability to exchange rights, with the ability to exchange materials across languages, and with the ability to be able to collaborate together. And I think this one notion within the intellectual property industry, and as I said earlier, for the books industry, this is a notion that hasn't been taken very well, at least in India. I have had some conversations with people across the world. I mean, I talk to people in the US or the UK. Of course, they have a very mature intellectual property and copyright industry. I also had happened to have a discussion a few weeks back with somebody from South Africa who was in the implementation business for copyright and intellectual property rights. So he was running the South African version of reprographic rights organization. And what I got to realize, even though South Africa and India are very comparable in terms of in terms of their development, in terms of the economy, in terms of economic strata of people around, in terms of the mix of poor versus rich, and the political and other landscapes, even though we are very comparable, South Africa seemed to be way ahead. And the key difference over there that I saw was, one, in the use of technology, and second, in the way the government was implementing the right kind of laws. I think things like what Mr. Manan talked about in terms of what government is doing to promote startups. That is fabulous. The Atal Incubation Centers providing free trademarks and everything is fabulous. But that all helps software products. That all helps manufacturing units. That all helps movies, music. There is very little work that gets done in the books industry for this, where there is real need for innovation. Authors in our country are anyway underpaid. I mean, except for when you go to a Chetan Bhagat or an Amish Tripathi, it is very difficult to find authors that make a lot of money. And within that background, to look at people that struggle and they're not getting, and stuff getting pirated or stuff getting copied and used becomes a huge challenge. And that's the role that technology really needs to play.
Yeah, thanks, Kapil, so much for those very powerful remarks, particularly on the fact that the publication industry is not using enough of technology, and they might actually be like staying with their old business model. So we'll be coming to that with a specific question later. And it is also interesting to notice that you highlighted a very important issue, that is the vast majority of our authors are not getting paid enough, and that's certainly a big crisis which we all need to address. Anyway, so let's, I think, go back to Ravi first, and then I'm going to come back to all of you. So Ravi, one of the things that was coming to my mind while hearing your remarks was, yes, I do agree that we cannot just wait and watch endlessly. We have to actually do or take certain actions on many of these fronts. But what do we do when we also see fundamental changes happening very, very quickly? For example, in the case of NFT, as you may recall, when it started, it was more used as a tool for copyright enforcement, right? But soon we started seeing it as being the subject matter of copyright. So when the fundamental role gets transformed, that to this quickly, what exactly can we do? In such a fast changing context, wouldn't it be more prudent to at least take a slightly slower, more thought out process rather than taking a knee-jerk action? How would you respond to that, particularly in the context of the change which we are seeing in NFTs?
I'm assuming that's a question to me, right?
Yes, Ravi. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, see, as we read in our jurisprudence classes that the law is always behind the society. I think it was Ehrlich, if I recall correctly. So that applies more strongly with how law catches up with technology. Yes, the technology will always develop at a faster pace. And unless we have sufficient number of use cases and a deep understanding of how it operates, we will not be able to enact proper legislations. So of course, I mean, I would not suggest a very, very hasty approach. But a couple of things need to be made sure, even as we are trying to address this whole, emerging tech world through intellectual property, there needs to be a fair bit of education also. So let's say, for example, we need to tell people what exactly is the kind of right that NFTs, for example, give you. So Jack Dorsey sold his first NFT of his first tweet at millions of rupees, right? But the copyright to the underlying asset is not transferred, right? You cannot really put it on your T-shirt and claim that I own it. You own that NFT, but the copyright to the underlying asset is never transferred, right? So those are the kind of things, the technicalities that, even though, I mean, as we kind of keep developing the legislation and how law needs to evolve, there needs to be a fair bit of education also, that, what is the kind of right that gets transferred. Let's say if one person sells the NFT to the other, what is the way in which the royalties will be calculated, especially if it is happening, let's say, in a virtual world. How will you do the impression per impression basis or clicking? All that kind of thing needs to happen. And as those things are happening and more education happens and we have better understanding, we can come up with proper and adequate legislation. So yes, I mean, I cannot say that we should just go ahead and in the hope that we don't miss the bus, we can't be acting hastily as well. But there is significant room to keep our fingers on the tap to ensure that we are not lagging behind. That is the approach that we should be taking.
Thank you, Ravi. And just one more question based on your initial remarks, because during the initial remarks, you rightly pointed out that in the context of games, most of the jurisdictions have taken an approach wherein, yes, they say that if you're including certain trademarks as part of the game, yes, maybe we should allow it under the exception, say, for example, under fair use and so on. In the context of metaverse also, do you think we should take that kind of an approach? Are you envisaging a radically different approach from the side of the courts when it comes to enforcement of IP rights in metaverse?
See, I think the way I look at it, some of the underlying principles would continue to be the same. So, for example, if, let's say, you are creating a verse where you are using, let's say, certain logos and trademark, not with the intent to benefit commercially out of it, right? If it is meant to be to create a world which looks very similar or exactly like the real world, just to give you that immersive feeling. Maybe to some extent we can ignore that, and we may not want to get into that kind of nitty-gritties and complicate things unnecessarily. But there are use cases within the same verse where something is being used deliberately to get some commercial advantage out of it, right? Especially what happens that, especially at this stage, many a times some of the kind of world that you create or the immersive experience that you create, they derive their value from a real world thing, right? So, for example, as I mentioned, if you present, let's say you have created a verse where there are people who are having a marathon race, right? And there's a very, very sought after, real, nice Nike shoe, which is known in the real world as giving you a great running experience, right? You want to take that leverage and use it here, right? That is for sort of kind of using someone's proprietary product for some clear commercial benefit. And that is where I think law needs to step in and ensure that the real owner in the real world doesn't kind of feel shortchanged, so to say. So that's basically the I mean, there is no clear, bright line to say where this world, this kind of business stops and the other one starts. But yes, broadly, that is the classification that I would like to make.
Very interesting remarks, Ravi, and it would also be interesting to watch how the courts across the world are actually going to like intervene in matters like this. How or where do they draw that very thin line, right? I think that's an interesting thing which we'll have to wait and watch. So let's now, I think, go to Manan. Manan, you explained in extensive detail why IP is required, IP protection is required for startups in India. But one of the things that was coming to my mind while you were also mentioning this was, to what extent are the Indian startup IP consumers? Because I mean, when you were presenting it earlier, we were only treating them as IP producers, right? I mean, I as a startup is producing something, we need to protect that. But as far as I understand, a vast majority of the Indian startups are also IP consumers. Are we taking enough measures to ensure that they get adequate access to protected IP? In other words, for example, if I as a startup wants to engage or come up with a new product in a particular technological area, say green technology, how do I get access to that particular technology? Are there specific government initiatives that are trying to give access to protected IP for startups in India?
Yes, great question. So there are many, agencies and government authorities who have been working in this domain, and there are many challenges run by government to these corporates, and it's a kind of a problem statement which the government itself kept open to these corporates and agencies who can work on this. So there are certain measures which from the investment perspective, also the investment teams and the venture capitalists also are working on. So it totally depends, and it's always a subjective matter when you are working with any idea or technology. Definitely, everything and anything will not be working till a certain stage, right? So the problem still persists at the ground level when it's just an entry barrier for a startup to who is just coming up with a sort of a thing. Because to if you are telling from a consumer point of view, and if you have much amount of cash in your startup, and definitely you can buy out the smaller startups who are just just emerging, and anyone can just purchase their IPs and can work on their ideas. Right. So this kind of stuff is currently being witnessed in the startup ecosystem, that especially in the edtech being one of the top segment currently the Indian startup ecosystem has been into. So these top giants, if we say that average, there are 2 to 3 acquisitions from these top giants in every week, right? So there are lots and lots of edtech players who have been into this domain, and every week there are 2 to 3 acquisitions from the IP perspective. So they leverage this kind of activities, and there is also, because there can only be one king for each and every industry, right? So if we go with many sectors, then definitely it will be totally depending subjective to the innovation that you have been carrying. And from the IP protection, definitely government has been working intensively for these for these to keep measures. So as I am speaking from incubation, so we have been granted some amount of funds, and there are mentors also directly been appointed from the government legislative itself to work on these IP protection, and to educate startup as well as normal people who are concerned about their IPs and stuff. So every week we host such number of events and workshops and events, like one-to-one sessions, definitely on how one can leverage these opportunities. And it's a kind of setup that has been totally funded by government, and it gives you a direct connect with the agencies, so they'll help you directly uphold on how one can leverage all these opportunities, and the IP can be protected.
Thanks, Manan. But yeah, I think Ravi wants to add a comment.
I think I would like to, because this is something which I have worked on directly, so maybe I'll just quickly add. So I think it was 2019 or 20 budget in which Nirmala Sitharaman had announced what is called a sovereign patent fund. Now the idea behind that fund was that essentially the way it operates in some of the countries like France, Japan, South Korea, and a couple of more countries is that generally what happens that sometimes there is a information asymmetry, that people don't even know that there's a intellectual property that there exists which can make my business better, right? And the second becomes what on many occasions, like when these big giants have these intellectual property, you don't have the negotiating wherewithal, right? So a fund sought to be created in the lines of sovereign wealth fund, which will have enough corpus to first of all identify that, okay, this is the kind of intellectual property, let's say small and medium enterprises, that could include even startups, need in our country. Then they go out, hunt for those IPs. And since they're bargaining for those IPs as a sort of a wholesale, if I were to use that traditional word, they can get it at a much cheaper rates as well, and then license it on to the startups and small and medium enterprises. So that proposal has been there. Of course, it's still in the works. I had some role to play in it. I did draft a concept note, and also I thought I'll just quickly intervene and mention that. So hopefully that will be on its way.
Yes, that is a very important clarification, because I mean that's certainly one of the major steps required in a country like ours, right? Because I mean, if we say, for example, identify one area of green technology like electric batteries, we see that okay, there are so many patents there, and there are so many startups who want to enter into that but cannot enter because of those patents. Yes, it is certainly an ideal approach to identify the relevant IP and then acquire those IP and then make them available for our startups, right? So I'm so glad to hear that there are initiatives happening.
And it's always
happier to hear that you are part of the drafting of that particular policy. Thanks so much, Ravi, for adding that input. I think Manan wanted to add some.
Yeah, it's always kind of a two-way communication, right? So since last 5 years, definitely, the government segment has been working very hard, especially, if we try to figure out that it may not, the government will not be working, if we say that it's currently on the privatization or, working on this or that. But regarding to IP and the, the study the government has been doing currently, the efforts they are putting in these particular industry are, tremendous, because the amount of funding that these, startups, especially from the, college level. So now they are also educated for IP from the college level itself. So that was the one of the thing that was lagging in our, when we used to study, right, 5 years, 10 years down the line. So to educate them with what is IP from 10th standard and 11th standard itself is, one of the thing that these initiatives can, come up with. So yeah, the word is spreading, a very good on the startup.
Yeah, thanks for I think reminding me of the keyword IP education and IP aware. So one of the other things which I wanted to certainly ask Manan, again based on his extensive work with AIC Adult Incubation Center, is see there's a vast amount of information available in patents whose terms got expired, right? So the patents that are in public domain now. Are our innovation incubation centers, particularly AICs, taking efforts to ensure that our startups are aware of the existence of these expired patents which they can freely use? Are there any educational efforts done in this particular regard?
Yes, if I talk about the state of Gujarat, like each and every state, I'll take honor that each and every state has come up with their own, startup policies.
Yeah.
At the policy level, intervention is definitely, one of the things that has been working for the IP protection. And definitely, so for the state of Gujarat, we have a SSIP fund. That is 2 lakh rupees of fund, especially deployed to for the IP, especially for the IP and protection for any startups or the ecosystem who have been coming. And incubation centers are already been provided with all the the hardware and the software through which these especially these kind the startups can do their own research. And they can search intensively for all the expired or the old patents or and whose or so they get access to all the information, right, which as a person from a private institute won't be getting. So these kind of things definitely they are leveraging from these kind of funds, right? So for each and every segment they have deployed funds from marketing to IP to having mentors to onboard mentors and everything, right? So from prototyping to IP, each and every segment has their own funding. So yeah, and 80% of all the IP things can be reimbursed from the government and incubation center itself, and as well as access to all these literacy and literature and things are already been provided by the incubation center for free to these startups for 12 months of time.
Nice. Manan, one final question from my side to you. See, most of our discussions when it comes to the relationship between IP and startups are limited to patents or trademarks.
Yes.
In your last 4 years experience with AIC, to what extent have you seen copyright either becoming an opportunity or becoming a challenge for the startups in our country?
Yeah, so I would say that patent and copyrights are the thing that venture looks forward before prioritizing their product into market. So it's the stage where before MVP has been done, the startup or venture comes up with idea of patenting or copywriting. So yes, you are right from your perspective that the copyright has been not given much importance compared to the patent, because it's always the we are working with the product or the process which are been pushed towards defending first rather than the copyright or the trademarks. Definitely there is but people are getting educated that these kind of stuff can also be done, especially from the NFTs are growing, and Web 3.0 is coming. So copyright has a very much importance in this particular thing. And if we talk about the IT is a huge segment in India currently, but there are no such copyright. You cannot copyright your codes currently, which is being done in the US or the other markets. So these small things also matter from the startups perspective. So rather they focus currently on more defending their patents compared to the copyrights. But there are copyrights there are, so if I take an example that in the last 6 months we had 25 plus startups claimed that they patented, and there were 48 patents from these startups, and there were at least 12 of them went for the copyrights for their thing, for their startups and ventures, and for their yeah.
Nice. Great. Thanks so much, Manan. Now,
Yeah.
yes, coming back to Kapil. Kapil, I mean, one of the most important things which you emphasized is, yes, publishers are not learning enough from their peers, particularly music industry, software, etc. When I look at the learnings that can actually happen from other peer groups like software or music, one of the important things which I also see is how they changed their business models. For example, when piracy became rampant with respect to music, I think what made the biggest difference is this change to subscription model, right? So when iTunes came in, yes, it was addressing a market need, and through that, yes, it also addressed piracy to a great extent. Today, I mean, if you look at the Indian context also, thanks to the different streaming services which we have, plus thanks to the existence of different FM stations which we have, we understand that, yes, music piracy has also gone down drastically in the Indian context. But when it comes to the books, one of the challenges which I have always noticed is we are still trying to stick to the old business model. And if you look at the pricing adopted for many of the books, particularly academic books, it's quite evident that it is targeted towards institutional buyers rather than individual buyers, right? So for example, there are many books which I use which are costing like more than 15,000 or 20,000 rupees per copy. And it is quite evident that in that case, I am not the target customer there, but it is my university library who is a target customer. Do you think it is time for the publishing industry to also realize that maybe it's time to change the business model and learn from the peers in this regard?
I'm so sorry. Yeah. So I will answer this question in two parts. First of all, it's not just the publishers who are lagging. I think before you get down to the concept of whether there is a subscription model or a pay-per-use model or something else, you first need to answer the fundamental question of how will you reduce or how you will remove the usage of pirated content. And that is a question that somebody like a government policy, that is a question that somebody like a Indian Reprographic Rights Organization or somebody else, or the Ministry of Commerce, or whether it is through the Cultural Ministry or HR Ministry or whatever, Education Ministry, somewhere the question needs to be handled in terms of how do you reduce piracy. Once you have, and it also becomes a chicken and the egg game. Once that gets done, there is the question of what sort of model gets developed, whether it is a subscription model, whether it's a pay-per-use model, or whether it is a combination model. So Amazon Prime may tell you, here is Amazon Prime subscription and you get all the things for free, but this one movie came in and it's a Avengers movie, and I won't give it to you unless you pay me 10 rupees more. Okay, and that sort of stuff is feasible. So there is a subscription model that can be formed, there is a pay-per-use model that can be formed. Before you get there, you need to first look at how will you reduce piracy overall and implement better intellectual property system. Now, in case of books, the problem also becomes that piracy is not just at the level of digital. The piracy is more rampant. In fact, if you look at this industry in terms of either people just photocopying books, or I even know of organizations that would develop proxy names, develop proxy author profiles, and publish the same book that has been done by somebody else in a different name. And they sell it globally, and they sell it at a reasonably high profit as well. I mean, so there are different aspects that kind of are there. I think over there, the question is more importantly, creating an ecosystem. And I've been saying this in the publishing industry for the last many years. Your problem is not individual publishers not being digitally savvy. Yeah, that's a problem, but that's not what stops everything. Your problem is not individual authors not doing something. Your problem is there is no ecosystem that exists. There is nobody that comes up and says, I own this ecosystem. I'm going to build the model. I'm going to do the lobbying that is required with the various government ministries. I'm going to create the technology that is required to provide those kind of controls. And then it goes on. I mean, try using Microsoft pirated software in your office. And within some time, somebody from Microsoft may actually come with a few cops and may actually come and lock your office. Have you ever seen that happen in the books industry? Is it, in today, the technology is can definitely enable that. But is there a law? Is there a structure? Is there a system? Is there a process that can do that? That is where the first level of intervention needs to happen.
Okay, so Kapil, I guess I might respectfully disagree with you on some of those aspects. Of course, I mean, that's primarily based on how we actually look at the history of music industry. Because I mean, if you look at the history of music industry, you would definitely notice that, yes, the music industry initially tried to fight the issue of piracy with lawsuits, but only at one point they realized lawsuits can only take them to certain level, because you cannot go and sue each and everyone, right? From an economic perspective, that doesn't make any sense at all. But then, yes, once they realized that is a losing battle, they changed the business model. Then, yes, the piracy came down. Now, I think no one is really bothered about that, or at least you are not hearing that much voice about the music piracy.
So I agree with you. That's it. That is why I said sometimes it will become a chicken and egg problem.
Exactly. So that's, I think, something which we'll have to agree to. Great. Second, I mean, I also had one additional question before I take up also quickly the questions from audience. You mentioned very specifically that there is a very unfortunate situation in India wherein the authors are getting underpaid, right? So there, do you think it is also a problem with respect to how the copyright societies or the authors organizations are working? Do you think there should be better collective bargaining mechanisms in place to protect the authors? We're talking here about authors, not publishers, since the remark was about authors.
Absolutely, absolutely. See, you are partly right saying, are there bargaining organizations or structures that's not really the only problem. I think it starts at the baseline. As at the baseline of the society, unless you are going to incentivize people to write more, to be more innovative, to do more, why will they? And what we have done in as a society is not paid the authors their due share. I mean, authors are one of the poorest communities if you look at working professionals. Most of the authors that I talk to, and I have myself, actually written a book and got it published. I can tell you it was a loss-making proposition by all stretches of imagination. I'm not even talking about my time that I spent writing, but even outside of that. And the challenge there is, we as a country, as a structure, we do not have a system that incentivizes first-time authors or newer authors to come in. When you talk about creating structures, creating bargaining powers and everything, the challenge is most of those organizations ends up becoming the bargaining power for the larger ones. I mean, they would want to sign up. Everybody wants to sign up the next Chetan Bhagat book. Everybody wants to sign up the next Amish Tripathi book. There was an announcement yesterday or day before, I think, about Ashwin Sanghi and his next book. Everybody wants to do that, but where are the publishers that are actually going to help support the newer authors? I mean, a new author essentially ends up authoring the book, paying the publisher for getting it published, and then ending up paying for the marketing to promote the book. And it becomes a fairly complicated process. In fact, that is one of the key missions that we are trying to solve at Frontlist, where we work with a lot of debut and new authors. We do literature festivals, and I remember in my last literature festival, one of the top authors telling me that I can't be speaking before or after a new author. And I mean, I went to the extent of saying, I said, thank you very much. You are not my target audience. My target audience is the new and debut authors, and those big authors that want to support the new and debut authors. But that process, that ecosystem, and I'm sorry, I keep using this word ecosystem, that collaboration is not existing in this industry. In music, that has happened, and probably because there are 4 or 5 key players that actually control the entire market. In movies, it has happened because there is, a small set of, production houses that controls a major chunk. In publishing, probably one of the challenges is that's not the case. I'm not proposing creation of more Amazons to have more control by any stretch of imagination.
Very interesting remarks, Kapil. So Kapil, I think now we will also take questions from the audience. So I think I'll start with you, because I think we can only now take 2 questions. So one question I think is something which I guess you are the better person to address. So let me read that. What is the future of publishing like? Do the speakers foresee a larger integration of publishing and content with metaverses, considering the fact that recently the first meta university was announced?
So I recently heard from a very prominent author, and I'm not going to name the author, but I recently heard from a very prominent author that some of the largest authors in our country are now thinking of creating content and actually, instead of publishing it as book, actually taking it to metaverse, or actually doing OTT based, series and other things. So creating the content not as books, but rather as movies and some other material, because they think that gets them better money. Okay. So that's a very, I mean, if some of the top authors, and I'm talking about authors that actually make a lot of money, if they are saying that, there is a problem. Okay. Now, in terms of integration, or in terms of looking at how publishing is going to evolve and what is going on, see, this is a very bad conception that publishing is diminishing. It is a very bad assumption that publishing business is going down. In reality, the average consumption reading of every individual, and I'm not talking about the readers, the book aficionados, everybody in this world, from you to me to the kid in first grade to somebody who is 70 years old, actual reading for everybody has gone up. Now, what content they are reading, what information they are consuming, and everything is debatable, but actual reading has gone up, actual viewership has gone up. What publishing industry needs to look at is how do they leverage it. So for example, for academic publishers, I mean, there is Byju's, there is Vedantu, there is, Upgrad, there is this, there is Unacademy, and so many people have come up in the last few years. I'm sorry, but what the hell were the publishers doing when all of these companies were coming in? Where is that, where is that mindset? So when you saw the growth of the Netflix, and you saw the growth of Amazon Prime, and you saw the growth of some of these OTT platforms, very quickly, the movies industry went there. Very quickly, the Abhishek Bachchans of the world said, yeah, I may not get such a great role in the movie. Let me go to an OTT platform. Where is that happening in the Indian space? And I'm talking more in the Indian context here. Where is that happening in the Indian publishing industry? The publishers, most of the times I hear them complain that digital is eating their business away. And I say, they are eating your business. They are not eating publishing business away. They're actually empowering better capabilities. And that is where I think the publishers just need to think about how do they evolve and take things to the next level versus a problem in the publishing industry. I disagree that there is any kind of problem.
Excellent remarks, and I think maybe we should end our discussion with that excellent remark that maybe we need to actually look at our business models. We need to look at our ecosystem and then identify the real problem, rather than say that, okay, there is a problem and yes, someone else has to actually find the solution for us. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for all the 3 panelists for sparing time today and for those excellent interventions. And I hope that these conversations will continue. And certainly, I'm sure this is the kind of conversations that we need to have for a fair balance in the IP system as well as in the society. Thank you so much. And I look forward to also meeting you sometime in future in person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good day.